I want to share with you today just about how I've gotten wrapped up in this Moravian missions movement idea. I've been so fascinated by the Moravians. I've been fascinated by Zinzendorf and Christian David and the Nietzschmans and the Dober and all these characters from 1700s that started this amazing missions movement. And I kind of want to backtrack a little bit and just remember, how did I get into this? I think it was February, I think it was 2021, and we were fasting and we were asking the Lord to speak to us. And out of that, I remember one day in particular, I think we were reading about the Moravians and the Moravian mission movements during this time. And what happened was one day we saw so many references to Ludwig, to Moravians, the Lord spoke. The day culminated in maybe 7 words, and the last one was, I read in this book that he wrote a lot of hymns. So I opened up the Baptist hymnal that I have on my shelf here, my granddaddy's Baptist hymnal, opened it up to the exact page of the one hymn of Ludwig von Zinzendorf, and there's like 700 entries in that hymnal, 700 plus. And I opened up to the one. It could be coincidence, could be the coincidence. I remember one was we looked on our piano here and it says Ludwig on it right there. And she's like, I'd never noticed this. There's a book that said Ludwig on it that we were reading it to our kids. Oh my gosh. So it got us thinking, I wonder if there's something in this for us. I wonder if the Lord would have us look into the Moravians. And what I discovered was, wow, I think they were a prophetic community. I think they were a community 300 years ahead of their time. They started around 21, 22, in that range, maybe 23. Zinzendorf corresponds with Zinzendorf was born in 1700. So if it's 1721, he's 21 years old. If it's 23, he's 23 years old. I think it started around 23 that people started coming. Christian David had a meeting with Zinzendorf. Someone had introduced them, and basically Christian David said, hey, can I bring refugees here? We're getting persecuted. We're getting slaughtered over here in Moravia. Can we come over here to Germany where you guys are and live in peace in your area? And Zinzendorf said yes, and didn't think anything about it until a few months later. Christian David shows up with these families, and they start building. The kind of overseer of his house, his estate, said, hey, you can build here. They built there. He comes home one day and he sees a light on the hill. Who's this? He goes up and meets him. Anyhow, so we started reading more and more books about it. And I do think that this is a prophetic community of how we are intended to live in the days ahead, maybe now. Many of you know the homesteading movement, the idea that you can your family moves to the sticks and starts living off the land. This has exploded recently. And with 2020 and beyond, 2020 people were really like, whoa, this is getting crazy. I want to be able to have my own food if things go south or whatever. It has exploded since 2020. It's been on the rise for a few decades. Check out Joel Salatin for some awesome stuff on homesteading. But I think the homesteading movement is a step. It's a stepping stone to get to the community steading movement. And what I mean by that is, it's hard to make it as a single family doing this. I don't know personally. It's people that are 1, 2, 3 steps ahead of us. We have several families here in the Waco area that are homesteading that we're learning from, and it's hard. Like if you go on vacation for a few days or you go visit your in-laws in the next city over, who's going to milk your cow? Who's going to water the garden? Who's going to feed the chickens? There's a lot of work to do. There's a reason why those guys had 10 kids back in the day. There's a reason for it. And that's why we need each other. We haven't needed each other in America for 100 years or so. I mean, we have progressively grown more and more independent. And are we that much better for it? Are we that much better than our great-great-grandparents 200 years ago who lived in a community and they knew their place in that community? This was the baker, this was the butcher, this was the doctor, this was the lawyer, this was the farmer. You need this, you get your milk from Mr. James or whatever. And they had relationships. And they had relationships that spanned generations. I was talking to a friend recently up in Boston, and he said it was the advent of the highway system, the United States interstate highway system, that really killed small towns or made it possible for people not to live where they grew up for hundreds of years, or however long for people to commute to visit family periodically. Yeah, that wasn't that long ago. Wasn't it World War II, the New Deal, highway system, boom, all over America, you can get anywhere. Are we that much better off for it? We have all these devices that make us connected, but are we really that much more connected in the deep level where you feel rooted and grounded in life? But I've grown to really love these guys, these Moravians. So I read every night before I go to bed. I'm reading a little bit on the Kindle, and these stories I'm often sharing with my wife, like weeping. Can you listen to this? Listen to what this person did. Listen to how these people lived. Listen to how they went back after everybody was slaughtered, and they went back to love again. It's just amazing the work that these people did. They had two communities. It was divided into two sides. It was the going and the staying side. And the staying side worked the land, had the industries. It was kind of like think of the Amish, or think of we have here in Waco a group called Homestead Heritage, that they have all these cottage industry things within their little Christian community that make money to the broader population, to those outside their community. So they're serving in all sorts of ways to what's needed in society. But the funding that's generated by these industries is sending missionaries out to the Caribbean, to Greenland, to South Africa, to wherever. The Moravians were everywhere. They went, before William Carey ever left for India, the Moravians were already on many continents. I don't know if they were on all the continents at that point, but they were in a lot of places. They started in 31, I think, 1731, maybe 1732. William Carey was 1791 or 1792, one of those, maybe 93. I don't even remember. But it was in the 1790s. They were 60 years ahead of the others, the modern missions movement. Something that's really unique about this community is it was a community of immigrants. So Zinzendorf was a rich guy, had all sorts of things going for him. One, he loved Jesus like crazy. He grew up without a father and really without a mother. He was raised by his grandmother and his aunt, who were godly, God-fearing women who wanted him to have the Word of God just bathed in it all the time. So he was studying, and he wasn't bitter. He said yes to Jesus every step of the way. And he said yes to his unique calling. I have nothing but awesome things to say about Zinzendorf, even though he lacked so much. Like if he were here, he would say he lacked so much administration to run the family business. It was basically like a big business. And so he always had people that helped manage it. His first wife was very administrative, and she helped run a ton of stuff. But Zinzendorf was visionary. He was visionary from the very beginning. So when he graduated, after he graduated, he went like traveling for a little bit before he went to serve in the king's court. I think King of Germany, whatever it was then, Austria, or I think it was, I'm embarrassed I don't know this. It was in Dresden is where he was serving. But before he went to serve in Dresden in the king's court, he went and did all these travels, and he met people in the Catholic countries, and he met people in the Protestant countries. And back then, that was a big divide. That was like your, whatever the big rift is that you see in the world today, that was the rift back then. People were getting slaughtered. Germany lost 2/3 of its population in 30 years to the 30 Years' War because they just were slaughtering each other. Sucks. And that war ended roughly the time that Zinzendorf comes on the scene, before the 1700s. But there's so many characters in this cast that built this community. Zinzendorf could never have done this by himself. The rich guy could never have done it by himself. It took the visionary Christian David, and Christian David was such an interesting character. He grew up Catholic, wound up with a boss that was a Protestant of some stripe, probably a descendant of the Hussites. John Huss was burned at the stake, and out of John Huss came all sorts of sects of Christianity that predate Martin Luther's Reformation. And they're just going, there's some crazy stuff in there, but there's also a lot of genuine faith that wanted to return to what the apostles believed and what the early church did, and to have the Bible in their own language, and to read it, and to the priesthood of the believers, and so many awesome things. But these are the guys that show up on Zinzendorf's door. These are the guys that show up there. This, 300 years of persecution and muscle memory of fighting for their faith, being willing to suffer and die for their faith. Everybody that wasn't willing to suffer and die for their faith flipped sides, became Catholic in that area. These are the guys that didn't. These are the guys that for generations weathered it or became Christians in that kind of a high persecution context. And they're the ones that show up on Zinzendorf's land. Berzeldorf, I think is what it's called. Zinzendorf had a vision after university for his land being kind of like a missions base. He wanted to have a printing press, and he wanted to have an orphanage, and he wanted to have a seminary, and he wanted to have a publishing company that sent literature all over Europe and sparked revivals, and for it to be kind of like a home base, a missions retreat center where people would come and get refreshing. And then this ragtag band of refugees shows up. We know that it wasn't just all honeymoon when those guys showed up, that there was a lot of troubles. In fact, they almost fell apart. They were dealing with different cultures, different languages, coming together, trying to love Jesus, but they had all sorts of different faith traditions. Like this one group comes out of 300 years of running for their lives and worshiping in secret, and, traditions and ways of viewing the scripture. And, think of your pet doctrine. What is the thing that your group believes that others don't necessarily believe? Well, they had all that in these two sects. You had a Lutheran sect of Christianity, and then you had the Hussites, or the United Brethren, Unitas Fraternitas, or I don't know how to say it, but the United Brethren was kind of encompassed a lot of these Hussite groups that descended out of John Huss. They were not Martin Luther's Reformation, but they were Reformed. They were not Catholic, very not Catholic, dying for not being Catholic, non-Catholics. And I just think that's awesome, that chaotic refugee and really put together community with Zinzendorf and all of his vision, that was the context that things blew up and did really well. Now, Zinzendorf's granddad, Ludwig's granddad, his name was Maximilian. He was the first person to come to Christ in their family lineage. And they were from money. They were from a high, influential, they'd served the Austrian Empire, the Austrian kings for a long time. And his granddad, Maximilian, became, this is Protestant Reformation, everybody's reading the scriptures, and he became a born-again Protestant believer. And persecution sweeping across all of Europe in a lot of different ways. Anyhow, long story short, the Zinzendorfs, their name at the time was Sin with an S, S-I-N Zendorf. They moved to Germany, and they became Zinzendorf with a Z. Now, they were aristocrats, so they came with a lot of money, a lot of power, and they wound up serving in the Saxony court. So the kings of that empire. Now, Maximilian had two sons, one of whom was George. Both his sons served high up in the Saxony government, and George also served. That's Ludwig's dad. And George served so well, he became a prince elector in the Saxony government. So he did really well. Ludwig was born in 1700, easy to remember all the dates related to the birth of the Moravian movement, because Ludwig was born in 1700. So 1723, people start coming to, he's 23 years old. 1731, they start sending out missionaries. He's 31 years old. 1765, he died at 65 or whatever. I think he died around then. Now, Zinzendorf, for the most part, was fatherless. His dad died when he was just 6 weeks old, and he grew up, and his mother then went to marry, I think when he was 2 or 3 or 4, someone in a neighboring empire, like a general in a neighboring empire. So he grew up with his grandma and his aunt, and they were godly as all get up, but he grew up without a dad. So listen to this that was recorded in their family Bible by his mom. On Wednesday evening, May 26, 1700, the Almighty God blessed me because of his grace with the gift of my firstborn son, Nicholas Ludwig, in Dresden. He became a fatherless orphan after 6 weeks because my sweetheart husband, his Lord and Father, the blessed Count von Zinzendorf, was torn from my side. The Father of mercy governs the heart of this child, that he may walk upright in the paths of virtue and may no wrong control him. Let his ways be strengthened by the word of God, and then he will not lack any goodness here or in eternity. He will indeed experience that the King of Kings and Lord of Lords has promised and said, I am the father to the fatherless. And then later on in the family Bible, you see written under it in Zinzendorf's own handwriting, it happened. Is that crazy awesome or what? I love hearing the story of this. How hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven? Pretty hard, says Jesus. But here we are in this family, this wealthy aristocratic family who is no stranger to suffering, embracing Jesus. I love it. Zinzendorf learned how to pray, and he learned how to pray by praying with his family, praying with his Aunt Henrietta. Growing up, she thought it was her duty to read the word to him and to pray with him in the morning and the evening, and they had this disciplined routine. And it seems to be a routine that he kept. This zeal for prayer and the dependence on prayer seemed to be it was formed in his youth, and he didn't depart from it. And I love that. He didn't solve problems with his money. He solved problems with prayer. When Herrnhut was falling apart, Zinzendorf solved problems with prayer. He went to the Lord, and the Lord spoke to him, hey, we need to focus on Jesus and introduce some rule and order. And here's 43 rules that we're going to go through. And if you're going to live here, this is how we're going to live together. I love that. How many challenges did they went through bankruptcy, they went through scandal, they went through all sorts of hard things happening, being kicked out, being chased out of his original homeland. He went through so many things, and he didn't puff up with pride of life and say, hey, we're going to get this done with, No, he went to God in prayer. I love that. Thank you, Jesus, for Aunt Henrietta that sowed into this young man an example of faith that he has given to the rest of us 300 years later. I really like this book. So I've read a lot of books on Zinzendorf and the Moravians. I like this one because this guy is German. He's alive now, I believe, or he was a few years ago anyway when he wrote it. And he was German. He got saved when he was young, and he went to Herrnhut in Germany, and he looked through all the old libraries and the old journals, and he's drawing from original texts, some of which belong to Ludwig and some of which belong to others, drawing out stuff in German and giving it to us in English. And the cool thing is, if any of you speak German out there is so much material in German on these people that has never come out. The missionaries had to keep a journal and write letters back and forth, maybe weekly, maybe daily. I don't know when it was, but people back then often wrote a lot in their journals, and they had correspondence. Like every night they'd be receiving letters and responding and writing and going. It's like inbox zero for old school, but it was with their hand. So there is so much material that has never been translated. I don't know how to read it. I don't know how to get it. It would be so cool for somebody to go in and OCR scan it so that we can all read it in our own languages, all this stuff. That would be amazing, because the Moravians have so much stored up in many storehouses, not just in Herrnhut, but also in Pennsylvania, where they had their second American community, but their American community that blossomed and blew up. It was actually two communities, I think. I think it was Bethlehem and also the one that was started by Whitfield that they took over. There was a period in their evolution as a people where they did not want to be paid for their work. They were a community. They were providing for each other's needs, but the funding that came out of their work was going to the mission field. They wanted it. To pay for it would be to cheapen it, is what was written in several of these books. I'm not sure how long that lasted. I don't know, but it's pretty darn cool. Now, I think homesteading is insufficient for several reasons. The workload is too much for one family, and you never get a break, and it's hard to share when you only have 2 kids instead of 10. How do you share all the load? Anyone that's homesteaded will know that it's very difficult you can't go on vacations, you can't go visit people for overnight anywhere, even need to be home early to put the animals down, get everybody in their pens. And when you have multiple families, you have more ability to share the workload. It might have worked, back in the day when we had 10 kids to kind of divvy up the responsibilities between you and your kids, but we don't have 10 kids mostly these days. We're having more, but that's one aspect. The second aspect is security. When you have one family, one dad, one mom, maybe some little kids, your options for defending yourself are much more limited than if you have 5 or 10 families together. Now, there's a lot of downsides to community. The hardest thing is it's hard to live in community. Community is not easy. You thought church was difficult. Wait till you taste living in community. It is a different ballgame, but it's better. And I'm convinced that it is the better way that the Lord has for us in these days ahead. There's 3 communities that I think hold a lot of examples for faith-based communities that will really help us in these days ahead. The first one is my favorite. It's the Moravian movement of the 1700s and extended on into 1800s, extends even till now because there's Moravian communities all over the world even today. But these guys are my gold standard. They had a community that sent out missionaries all over the world. They were industrious. They had all these industries in their communities, and they funded the mission movement around the world. They lived in tight community. They had 24/7 prayer. They had an eldership that I think was awesome. They did so many things that I think were just amazing and beautiful. Second example is the Essene movement, the Essenes. The time of Christ, a lot of people think John the Baptist was an Essene. They were a group of people that lived out in the wilderness. This is the group that lived out in the sticks. They went into the wilderness. They kind of pulled out of life in Babylon, so to speak, life in Rome, so to speak. We're fasting, we're praying, we're writing down the scriptures. And this is the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they were a part of not just one of Christ's appearing. They're a part of 2 because the Dead Sea Scrolls are very applicable for right now. You know, until the Dead Sea Scrolls came about, people thought, oh, the Bible's probably been changed a bunch of times. A lot of people suspected there's probably going to be a lot of errors in transmission over these many centuries. And then they had the Dead Sea Scrolls came out, and it's like, oh, nope, actually they're almost perfect. There's very few scribal errors. We also have all this Second Temple literature, this intertestamental period, that things like the Book of Enoch and other books that were written that people were reading devotionally at the time of Christ, preserved within the Dead Sea Scrolls. The last example I think is one of the most interesting. It is the Kibbutz movement in Israel. Now, how did this happen? Jews had been moving to Israel for a long time. This is not a new phenomenon. For centuries, they'd been moving there and had been living there. But in the 1900s, it started in earnest and to grow rapidly. I think before 1900, there was like 0.5% of the world's Jewish population was in Israel. By now, it's like half. Now it's like half of the world's Jewish population lives in Israel. But how do they survive in this wilderness of a desert with sometimes hostile neighbors? They form these kibbutzes. I would say kibbutzes, the plural of kibbutz is kibbutzim, I think, in Hebrew. I don't know. I don't speak Hebrew. They formed these groups for 2 reasons. 1, safety, and 2, share the load. Same principle. They needed to protect themselves, and it's a lot of work. Now, these kibbutzes started as socialist, almost communist experiments, and they've grown over the past 100 years. First one was 1909. Here we are 114 years later, and they're still going strong. So these started as kind of pure socialist communities, where everything was shared and to each his own, to each according to his ability, from each according to his ability, to each his own. It was genuine. But they've evolved into something very, very different over the past 114 years. So now I would say many are capitalistic in nature, but they're like cloistered communities, gated communities with a lot of shared values and a lot of shared everything. I'm really excited to correspond with more kibbutzniks, people living on kibbutz, about how things have been run. Like, what are the different ways to run things on a kibbutz, administratively, organizationally? How do you set these kind of communities up? Like, what are the things that you've learned from 114 years of sweat and sweat equity? How do you run these things? I think there's going to be a modern American kibbutz movement. Now, what is a kibbutz? A kibbutz is just a community of people. It's a Hebrew term for these communities that they started back in 1909. Now, some of these early kibbutz communities, it's like all the men worked, all the women worked, all the kids were in one place. They were raising their kids communally, and they did that so that the women could work more and harder. The women had guns. The women did a lot of the leadership stuff. And that's why Israel had one of the first female prime ministers in the world. Not the first, but they were one of the first, because they had these women in leadership roles and running things and shooting things and plowing things from the early 1900s. They were out there doing it because they were raising their kids communally. I think that fell out of favor later on because people want to be with their families. Moms and dads want to be with their kids. But it's interesting nonetheless. It's interesting that the Moravians had something similar to the modern-day kibbutzes. The Moravians had a season where they raised all their kids communally as well. And women were definitely a huge part of the workforce in the Herrnhut communities. Herrnhut community and the communities they built, the Moravian communities around the world. It's interesting that in the news recently, we've had this war in Israel that's going on right now, and it started with an invasion of Gaza, and almost all the places that they took out, minus the big dance party in the desert, were kibbutzes, were communities of people, gated communities with fences all around, and they got in. And there were two kibbutzes, of my understanding, two, where the security detail said something doesn't smell right, and they went to the armory and got their guns, and they prepared. And both of those fared very well when the terrorists came into their communities. The others fared very poorly when they didn't get the armory in time. They didn't defend themselves. I think there's something to be said for these communities. Like Paul writes in Romans to the Jew first and also to the Greek. What happened in Israel, I think, is going to happen worldwide. And a lot of people are kind of talking about this, that it's coming to every nation, this a spirit of violence. My good friend of mine had a dream recently of the outlaws becoming the Antichrist army. I'll send a link for that so you can see that. The outlaws becoming the Antichrist army. There's outlaws in every nation, and there's been outlaws there's communities of outlaws that are intentionally released into populations. And Rick Joyner I think it was around 2012, I heard about it in 2014, had a dream about this ancient Mesoamerican violent spirit in waves coming up through the southern border of America. And he actually saw in the dream a ranch in Texas that had been taken over by this group, and they were doing pretty horrible things, much like the things we saw in Gaza recently. He would say way worse, stuff that would make ISIS blush. I think it's really interesting that the kibbutz movement has kind of morphed from a socialist experiment that was, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Is that how the phrase goes? It was true socialism around a vision. And they have morphed into capitalistic communities with shared values and vision to a degree, with some sort of industry at the center of it funding the party. They're not all like that, certainly, but it seems like that's a common thread now, is that there's an industry or industries that make a lot of money. They produce 40% of the nation's agriculture, and it's either 6 or 8% of the nation's industry. And they make up 2% of the population. So there's something really unique going on in these communities. I wonder how much we can save money-wise. Say you have 5 like-minded families living together in community. In community meaning each family is autonomous. Each family has their own space and land and house, and nobody's raising kids communally in the sense they're not sleeping in the same dormitory. But there's a lot that's shared, meaning you don't need 4 trucks in Texas. You need 1, maybe 2. 1 little one, 1 big one. You don't need 5 sedans. You need a couple. You need 1 big minivan or 1 big 15-passenger van that can get a group of you around here or there. Less vehicles is less car insurance. Maybe there's shared things. Maybe there's one group that has internet. Maybe there's one main location you want to do internet. Maybe you don't like internet invading every room of every house all night. Maybe you have problems with the frequencies that you don't really want, these different invisible frequencies. There's a whole debate, maybe I'd say a suppressed debate about the effect of frequencies on our body. Maybe you don't want that in your house all the time. Maybe you want that to be in a location, one of the houses that can be kind of monitored, both for the pornography sake of not wanting porn coming into your community and the sake of, just not wanting to be addicted to these devices. We've experienced it several times when we lived in Malaysia. We lived in a high-rise apartment with several families that were like-minded, like-hearted, and we met others while we were there that were like-minded. And it was so fun to be able to pop up and pop down. Hey, do you have sugar? Or, hey, y'all want to come over let's go swim at the pool. You want to go? Or, hey, you want to come up for a little bit? Oh, I put the kids down. Oh, it's okay. This person can go babysit for a little bit or whatever. It's fun living in communities. It's hard, but it's way better than living by yourself. Maybe you know of a community in your church network. Like there's people in your community, they all kind of live in the same. I have a former friend that I haven't talked to in 20 years. But he apparently, I know this through a friend, they wanted to do community in a city context. So what they started doing is acquiring the houses on the street and then selling those houses to their community, their friends, and living in a communal context in the city, in the suburbs. And I think my buddy told me they have 3 blocks of houses now in this community. I think that is so cool. Like we could really do this, guys, in a city context. It might take a little time, but community is how we're intended to live. We're not meant to live alone. Our idea of community in America, God has so much more for us communally than we have tasted and seen. I want to jump in wholeheartedly, and I want to find the people, and I want to find the place, and I want you to do it too, regardless of where you are around the world. We were meant to live Christianity in community, not in ourselves. So many times when it says Christ in you, the hope of glory, that's you corporate. That's not you singular. You are the body of Christ, and the glory of God is in you corporately.